Joining us now to discuss other important Catholic stories this week is the editor-in-chief of the Catholic Herald in the UK, a 25-year veteran reporter on church affairs. Please welcome Damian Thompson back to the program from London. Damian, thanks for being with us. The big story in Britain this week, really all over the world, was the near-forced abortion of this baby at just 22 weeks. A UK justice who is a known activist ruled last week that the mother, a woman with mental difficulties and disabilities, wasn't fit to parent the child. The justice said that an abortion was in the woman's best interest, and it appeared that the ruling would be carried out until Monday of this week. Tell us about the case and this justice, Natalie Leven.
The case was one of the most horrible things ever to happen in a British courtroom, one of the most horrible judgments ever handed down by a British court, and thank God it was stopped. But this activist judge, as you rightly describe her, Natalie Leven, ordered a 22-year-old mentally disabled woman to abort her child, or to allow, it wasn't a question of allowing, but basically the judicial execution of this child was announced. And the Catholic world, the humanitarian world, was unbelievably horrified by this. The woman was given no choice in it, but insofar as she understood it, she didn't want it to happen.
Right.
And her mother, the baby's grandmother, who's a Catholic Nigerian midwife, didn't want it to happen and said she would arrange for the baby to be looked after. But nonetheless, the decision was handed down very firmly. It was almost as if Mrs. Justice Leven was wearing a black cap in the way that British judges used to put on a little black cap when they announced the death sentence. And this happened on Friday. And from Friday until Monday, there was growing anger, which I picked up very clearly from the Catholic Herald's US readership, especially from the US, of this horrible ruling with totalitarian overtones. And all weekend, I waited for the Catholic bishops of England and Wales to say something, because the judicial system is different in England and Wales, they're separate. And so I was waiting for them to say something, and nothing was said. I sat there reading the Twitter feed of the Catholic Church in England and Wales, and all weekend there were just sort of PC witterings on this and that subject. So the Catholic Herald stood up to the plate and asked the bishops to speak, emphasizing, you know, how horrified Catholics were around the world. And on Monday morning, we got a statement from a junior bishop called John Sherrington, an auxiliary in Westminster. Has a pretty good reputation as an Orthodox Catholic, but it began by noting that every abortion is a tragedy for the family involved. Now, as soon as you hear a sort of truism, a throat-clearing truism, I described it like that, you know that nothing memorable or significant will follow. And sure enough, he came out against the abortion.
Yeah, well, let me read. I'll read you. Let me share with the audience
human rights of the mother and the child.
Damian, I want to share the audience the rest of John Sherrington's, Bishop John Sherrington's statement. He says, in our society, there's a delicate balance between the rights of the individual and powers of the state. This was a sad and distressing situation for the whole family. What impression, if any, did this message make?
It was summed up beautifully by the great writer, Tim Stanley, a columnist for the Catholic Herald, who tweeted out, "We note with regret that Jesus Christ has been nailed to a cross. Our thoughts and prayers are with his family at this time." That's the impression it made. There was not a note of the righteous anger that, I was with my sister, and a wonderful neighbour who's not Catholic, and probably doesn't buy all the church's teaching on abortion. But when I explained what was happening to her, she was in tears. And when the ruling came through on Monday that it had been cancelled, I got a text message from this lovely woman saying, "Thank God, a life has been saved." So if non-Catholics who aren't completely pro-life were that horrified, where was the horror from the English bishops? And actually, where were the celebrations when this murder, this execution, was cancelled, was overruled by the Court of Appeal?
I want to share with you something
look,
that...
I've spent 30 years
I want to read...
watching these bishops do nothing. And
I want to read something from Lord David Alton of Liverpool, a guest on this program. This was from his column this week in the Herald, and I want to contrast it with the Church's response. He said, the truly chilling decision to end the life of a child against the wishes of its mother and grandmother and against the advice of a social worker would have been a coercive abortion worthy of the People's Republic of China. Now, Damian, your thoughts on Lord Alton's words, and why couldn't the bishops of the UK muster something at least as strong?
Well, that's precisely the question I asked in a column I wrote next to Lord Alton's. He's a very old friend of mine, and he is the single politician in the United Kingdom whom I admire most. And I said if a bishop had made that perfectly reasonable point about this being worthy of the People's Republic of China, people would have talked about it. But it would have rocked the boat. And something happens to even the most orthodox bishop, one or two exceptions maybe, but even an orthodox bishop like John Sherrington, as soon as they get the mitre, it's like they're taken in a little room and told the bishop's 13th commandment, which is, thou shalt not rock the boat. And we're not talking about the bark of Peter, it's like something Henley or whatever, just don't rock the boat. And they never do. But this time they've miscalculated, because I believe, and my colleagues at the Catholic Herald believe, that we are approaching what I call the pro-life moment. We have seen atrocities in New York State. We've seen this thwarted atrocity, and we've seen people who counted themselves as pro-choice beginning to think again. And the fact that our bishops, and let me include your bishops as well, Cardinal Supich, feeble things he's been saying recently, are not leading public opinion on this is a betrayal of their orders and a betrayal of their identity as Christians and their identity as shepherds.
I want to, before this case was overruled, or the ruling was overruled, the justice had determined the mother would suffer greater trauma by having her baby adopted than by having an abortion. What exactly was that based on? I mean, what was the criteria for determining that, Damian?
I don't know. The whole thing is so twisted that you almost wonder if the forces of darkness are involved. And I don't normally say that sort of thing. But it was as if this judge wanted the abortion to happen. And who was it? It was Archbishop Chaput who said recently that the Democratic Party, but this would also hold for left-wing opinion in Britain, has almost turned abortion into a perverse sort of sacrament, something that was holy in itself.
Damian, we've had the Charlie Gard case and others in Europe where the government intervenes in family and very personal decisions, saying it knows best. This was a very close call. What was the role of the NHS, the National Health System here, and was the appeals court overruling a strong statement for protecting life? Or do you expect to see more of rulings like this?
I don't know too many of the details, and lots of the details have been withheld from us. I don't know to what extent this is a debate about the NHS. I genuinely don't think this is a debate about socialised medicine, as you call it, which is a very complex subject. We have
and I know beloved in England. I was just there, and people love the NHS.
Private and socialised medicine here, but people love the NHS. I like bits of the NHS, I must say. I don't like other bits of it. I'm certainly against worshipping the NHS. It seems to be. Nigel Lawson once said it was the only closest thing to a real religion that the English people actually have, which is the NHS. But you know, I'm not going to condemn everybody in the NHS, because there are, for example, doctors and nurses in the NHS who are changing their minds about abortion because they can see the advances that are happening in science, the increasing viability of the fetus, as they always call it, to the point where they're going to have to stop talking about it as a fetus. Funny how it's always a baby when it's, you know, maternity stuff and baby showers and things like that before it's born, but it's a fetus if you want to kill it. I've watched people get radicalized. I've watched American friends of mine get radicalized. I've seen the March for Life grow enormously. I've always grotesquely unreported, of course. But the pro-life moment is approaching. And it's up to us, you and me, Raymond, to actually play a part in that.
I touched on this with Ed Penton earlier, and I need to touch on this with you. Some very high-ranking criticism of that working document for the Amazon Synod that we're seeing. This is going to take place in Rome in October. One of the dubia cardinals, Cardinal Walter Brandmuller, issued a stinging critique where he called the document heretical and imparts apostasy. Your thoughts on this? Now, some will say, you know, this is Brandmuller himself has said it should be rejected with all decisiveness. Now, I know you've got some thoughts on this Amazon Synod in general. What do you make of Brandmuller's assessment?
It's an incredibly powerful and well-written document. I'm in two minds on the subject of bringing heresy and apostasy as concepts into it. Not because I disagree with him, but because I think the debate will become so focused on the precise meaning of those words. So there'll be long debates about, no, it is heresy, no, it isn't heresy, and it'll become a debate between theologians. Actually, Cardinal Brandmuller made so many brilliant points in that document. For example, he called it an aggressive intrusion into the purely worldly affairs of the state and society of Brazil. And he asked what professional expertise authorizes an ecclesial synod of bishops to make statements in these fields. But the point I really liked in Cardinal Brandmuller's document was his criticism of the way that the forests of the Amazon region are being viewed by a Vatican working document as a special source of divine revelation, which was my reaction when I read this garbage. It reads like a sort of pithy Disney production, you know, Avatar, written by octogenarian European socialists. Tell us, O wise ones, what the spirits of the forest are telling us. And as for its patronizing liberal sanctification of indigenous religion, let's take a look at the main author of this document, who's Bishop Irving Kreutler. Now, the redoubtable Micah Hickson has been doing some burrowing. She's revealed that he's come out against criminalizing the infanticide, which is sometimes carried out by some indigenous peoples there. And I certainly don't wish to libel them all and to say that it's a very widespread practice, but it is a problem there. And this nearly 80-year-old Austrian bishop, very anti-colonialist, of course, but he's an Austrian bishop in charge of this project, in charge of drawing up the document,
right,
has come out against criminalizing the infanticide, sometimes practiced by some of these people, because here, in the name of human rights and under the pretext of suppressing infanticide, a broad ethnocide, a cultural murder is being installed. If that means anything, it means something very sinister.
Yeah, no, that's troubling.
There's another point. A very, very good article written by the formidable Father Roger Landry. Now, I was recently in Rome, had the great privilege of attending a pilgrimage led by him. And he made a point about the plan to ordain elders because there's a shortage of priests in the Amazon. And he said, most of those in the Amazon don't have access to adequate quality formal education. We're not talking about the ordination of married men with doctorates, masters, or even bachelor's degrees in theology or anything else. We would be studying whether to ordain even those with only an elementary level education, such as they might struggle even to read the scriptures and the missal. And then Father Landry goes on to make the point that the very, very uneducated clergy of the Middle Ages led us into all sorts of problems which helped cause the Reformation. The whole thing worries me enormously. Look, I've been down the Amazon. I've visited a strange religious group. I've visited a particularly very strange religious group in the Amazon, not necessarily representative, but I do know that religion in all parts of the developing world is syncretic,
right,
and therefore not fully Catholic. And to be using this bit of the world as a laboratory for religious experimentation is beggars belief. And my personal message about the Amazon Synod is cancel it now.
I want to move on to another story out of Rome this week. As the McCarrick investigation drags on with no results, Argentinian Bishop Gustavo Ancheta, who's facing a criminal sexual misconduct trial in his home country, has been granted permission by an Argentine judge to leave the country and return to Rome. Now, why has this man, with his checkered past, to say the least, I'm putting it lightly for my audience, why has he been given another accommodation, and why would the Vatican permit him to come into their midst?
There are so many similar questions one could ask about a range of unsavory characters who seem to find sanctuary in the Vatican. And the case of Bishop Ancheta, of course, is the most notorious of all of them. I find this deeply troubling. Recently, I talked to a cardinal, one who's it would have been regarded as pro rather than anti-Francis, and I went through all these cases, some of which he didn't even know about. And I said, these are cases in which really serious questions about decisions made by the Holy Father need to be answered, and he's refusing to answer them. It's your job as a cardinal to ask those questions. Now, he hasn't, he won't. But what I did notice is he didn't put up a single word of defense of the current advisors to the Holy Father, if we'll put it diplomatically.
Well, what is the message, though, Damian, here? What's the message this is sending to the faithful?
The message this is sending to the faithful is, this is none of your business. Even though it is the children of the faithful or the faithful themselves who have had to suffer from these scandals, either directly as the victims of abuse, or they've seen parish life disintegrate, their family life disintegrate. The message is, well, it's the same message that was sent when the horrible, now dead, Cardinal Danneels tried to cover up incestuous child abuse and then was invited to a synod on the family. It's hard to sum up the message in polite words, so I won't try.
Yeah, I don't blame you. It was announced recently the Church in Scotland has authorized an independent audit of all its dioceses to ensure that sex abuse cases are being properly handled. Your thought on this, independent being the word, of course, why are the bishops in the UK having an easier time agreeing to this than their counterparts in other parts of the world?
Those were the bishops in Scotland, and the situation is rather confusing, but basically the Church in Scotland is quite separate from the Church in England and Wales. And the Church in Scotland, it tends to be very left-wing in some areas. It is unhealthily close, I think, to the nationalist government. But in many ways, it's quite strong and fearless. And I heartily applaud its decision to submit itself to this scrutiny, if you like, to have the humility to say, we can't be trusted in these matters. And it is clearly what needs to happen in some shape or form in America. And I really don't think you can improve on the broad formula set up by Father Gerald Murray on your program, which is for independent tribunals to be given the authority to look at every document in every chancery all over the world.
And then,
this is what we need.
I've been on my high horse for years.
You would agree with me.
Well, Damian, for years I've been on my high horse.
Thank God you have.
They should also have an independent financial audit of every diocese that should be run by the laity. That should happen yesterday.
Absolutely. And here's the Catholic Herald. It says, cleaning up. Catholics must demand urgent financial reforms. And here's a picture of one of the wonderful cartoons of two bishops with in a restaurant with the cast might be familiar to anybody who watched The Sopranos. It's precisely what we're saying.
Well, I agree with you.
And we'll work with you on this.
We should talk more.
Promise.
Also in Scotland, the church there announced it would not be changing the words of the Lord's Prayer, despite the clear wishes of the Pope. Your thoughts? Is this a minor issue of semantics, or does it potentially change the words of Christ in a significant way?
Who knows? I do know that it's entirely unnecessary. Who knows whether it changes the words of Christ? But those who are experts in New Testament Greek, but of course he didn't say it in New Testament Greek, say that it does change the words of the New Testament Greek. And clearly, even I can see that it changes the words of the Latin. Why? Why is it necessary? Looks to me like change for the sake of change. Or possibly change to distract people from the really important and worrying stuff that's going on in the church. I don't see the need for it. And I don't see the academic arguments for it. If you wanted to change anything, it would probably focus on the word temptation rather than lead us into, because there are there are apocalyptic resonances,
Right.
a time of trial, that Christians will be led into a time of trial at the end of time. But that's not what this addresses. This is just a sort of tidying up. And, you know, somebody's dreamt it up, Spadaro or somebody like that has dreamt it up. It's a manageable story for the Vatican. The really unmanageable stories, the ones involving Ancheta, the ones involving all sorts of things happening quite close to the Holy Father, these are not being pursued, and the Vatican doesn't want them pursued.
I also need to ask you,
the Catholic Herald is about to make a big appointment in Rome.
yeah, I also want to ask you about this religious freedom story in Australia. A professional rugby player, he's really going through the blades for his history of speaking out against gay marriage. Now, he's been dismissed from the league for now. Now, he does so on religious grounds. And you have an Australian Christian group that's gone to bat for him. They've raised over $1 million for his legal fees. He's suing the Rugby Association. What's happening to religious freedom in Australia?
Well, there's a very selective attack on free speech in Australia and in other countries. There's something about Australia and perhaps Canada as well. And free speech is being curtailed. But it's the free speech of Christians that is specifically being curtailed. We know that many religions hold very, very conservative views on sexual matters. And it's not a problem for anybody if they express them. It's only a problem if Christians express them. I did a podcast for The Spectator about this just a few days ago, asking why is it that it's the expression of Christian views, whether you agree with them or not, that is being curtailed, that is being really suppressed in this case. And the justification given by the rugby authorities was so pathetic. They basically they want to shut him up. It's not about professional standards. It's not about the game. They just don't want to hear these views expressed, so they want to shut him up.
Last week we reported that the head of the Knights of Malta, and we talked about this with Ed Penton, that he banned the celebration of the traditional Latin Mass, the extraordinary form, in all the official ceremonies of Malta. Give me your sense. The Pope is meeting with the Grand Master this week. Why the hostility to the old Mass, particularly in an order as old and historic as the Knights of Malta?
It makes no sense at all, except as, if you like, a sort of victory lap by Boselager, the German who's taken over the Knights of Malta. I mean, the Grand Master is just a figurehead, really, for Boselager. It's a convoluted business. I think Ed Penton revealed that some Scandinavian woman had a particular hatred of the old liturgy, and this was her request. We carried a very strong cover story about this. And about the way that religious orders, if you count them as a religious order, are particularly, it's very easy to control. It's very easy to make sure that Summorum Pontificum is not observed in religious orders. It's much harder for that to happen in parishes. And today comes the news that the Grand Prior of the English Order of Malta, Ian Scott, who appallingly, I thought, defended the ban on the traditional Mass in a letter to the Catholic Herald, has been sacked. In fact, there seems to have been it's just breaking today. I was reading on my phone on my way to the studio. There seems to be another wave of sackings and purges, and you know, I wonder whether the Order of Malta really exists anymore, to be honest.
That's my sense. Well,
but as for its suppression of the traditional Mass, it's an absolute disgrace.
Well, the members of Malta should raise up and let their voices be heard. I mean, it's their dues that perpetuate this order. It's their philanthropy.
Well, I hope the American ones will. I hope the American ones will, because a lot of them are very attached to the traditional Mass. And the idea that the traditional Mass is divisive is something that I think it probably was the case 20, 30 years ago. But what really worries the aristocratic liberals, and my goodness, the Boselager and his chums are incredibly aristocratic. What really seems to worry them is that the old Mass has ceased to be divisive. That's what they don't like. The young Catholics are going to it, if you like, to escape the liturgy wars in other parts of the Church.
Right. Well, they look, if you talk to young Catholics and spend time with them, they're going to the Latin Mass because they don't like the hand-holding and the guitar, introductions at these other Masses. And they realize, oh, this is what it's supposed to be. That's what they tell me, at least. Now, I go to both rites. I've seen it all.
I mean, I never cease banging on. I mean, look, even my generation hated that. What's the phrase I always use for it? Joan Baez meets Hildegard of Bingen in a 1970s cocktail lounge. It's a horrific sound. You never hear it otherwise. This music that's written by not the St. Louis Jesuits anymore. They've all left apparently. But it's written by these rather well-off, heavily copyrighted professional composers in league with their local bishops and whatever. There's a lot of money involved. But you hear that horrible music. You never hear it in the outside world. It's a sort of excruciating little genre.
It's its own genre. It's a time warp. It's like a nostalgia track.
They don't approve of.
Anyway, Damian, when we last spoke,
it's a nostalgia track that actually makes even genuine old hippies who heard proper, folk music and rock music. Actually, it makes even them cringe.
They repel as well. No, they're not there. They're not in the pews either. Damian, when last we spoke, your dear sister Carmel was suffering some ill health. How is she doing?
She was. She'd been diagnosed with stage 4 ovarian cancer, which is a very serious diagnosis. And I am absolutely delighted to say that she is in remission.
Wow.
She is bursting with health and energy. We spent a wonderful day on Sunday with Rosa Monkton, who's founded the charity Team Domenica named and working with her daughter Domenica, who has Down syndrome. And something that gives me real pleasure is that Carmel, who was qualified as a medical doctor, has had a very successful career in medical advertising, but has also been Catholic, has also been a pro-life counsellor. Carmel's going to be joining us and supporting us in a major pro-life project that the Catholic Herald is going to be launching. Our provisional name is the Mission for Life, and it's one that seeks to join together the fight for life, the fight for unborn life, and the fight for persecuted Christians. In other words, babies murdered in the womb and Christians murdered outside of it. And we're very lucky in that our new consulting editor, Father Benedict Keeley, who I'm sure you know, a great hero of mine, is going to be, well, not just advising, but directing us on this. Because, we're called the Catholic Herald, and obviously we refer to ourselves as the Herald, but there's 2 names in our title, and the first name is 1,000,000 times more important than the second.
Well, Dr. Damian Thompson, thank you so much for being with us. Our best to Carmel and everybody there. For more reportage that Damian spoke of, you can go to CatholicHeraldUS.com, or on Twitter, he's at Holy Smoke. Thank you, Damian. We'll check in with you soon.